I was one of those kids that would often have reactivity around authority. So when an authority figure would tell me what to do, I would often get angry. Now, not always. If I was around an authority figure who I respected, or if I was engaged in some kind of an activity of my own choosing, then I would often be very respectful and even compliant. If, on the other hand, I was around adults who had an attitude of kind of being entitled to dominate me and consolidate power over me, then I would be pretty reactive and rebellious. Now, stepping back for a minute, in our society, there is a pretty big phenomenon of kids that have reactivity around authority, which we call kids that have issues with authority. And I would say that there are two key aspects to how we understand this. The first is that we view it as a problem with the kid, as opposed to, for example, a problem with the environment. This is just so fundamental that we take it for granted, and it's right there in the phrase, kids that have issues with authority. The other main aspect to how we understand and deal with this problem is that we medicalize it. We often make it out to be a medical problem in the kid. Let's unpack both of those. So the first is we view it as a problem with the kid. This is in contrast to considering if maybe there are issues with the environment, to viewing it from a more systemic perspective, where maybe the issue has to do with the kid in relation to the environment. Why is it a problem with the kid as opposed to, for example, a problem with the people around the kid? Maybe they have a lot of unresolved issues and they're making the kid the problem. Why is it a problem with the kid as opposed to perhaps the paradigms and practices that are being used to relate to the kid? Well, we tend not to actually ask these questions, and instead we tend to focus on the kid, and we assume that the kid must be the person with the problem in the situation. But of course, asking these kinds of questions about the environment could really get us to the root cause of the issue. The other main aspect to how we understand kids that have issues with authority is that we tend to medicalize the problem. And this is something that really complicates the situation greatly, and it can really obfuscate what's really going on. Because I think that what happens is if somebody says that something is a medical issue, it's really hard to question that. Almost on some level, you have no choice but to just accept it. This was me for a long time. I just assumed, well, if somebody says that something is a medical problem, then I basically just have to accept that because it's a scientific fact. Because why would somebody say that if they don't have a very solid factual basis for saying it? Well, what I came to discover was that oftentimes this is what happens, particularly in the area of mental health, or I should say perhaps, as far as I understand, solely in the area of mental health. This is what happens, is that often something is said to be a medical problem, not because there's a really solid scientific basis for it, but because it's basically a political decision. Basically, the people that have power in a given situation will utilize the mental health field to basically call something a medical problem so that, again, the real issues don't need to be dealt with, and basically the individual that is causing problems can basically be marginalized and silenced on some level. This has happened. There's so many examples of this happening throughout history, and I definitely think that this is a lot of what is happening with kids that are said to have issues with authority. One of the big challenges with being medicalized in this way is that coming out of it, we're just so brainwashed by it. We really lose our real perspective about what happened, and we really, I would say, lose a connection to ourselves and to our own power, because this, monumental authority has just told us how to view the situation, which is so different from our own real perspective. Now, in this prevailing paradigm for understanding kids that have issues with authority, what doesn't happen is a meaningful attempt to understand the kid's perspective. And it's very clear to me that if we want to meaningfully address the issue, then that should really be central. That should really be at the core of understanding kids that have issues with authority. Now, what might be some things that could be really at the core of the kid's perspective? Well, one thing could be that the kid feels misunderstood a lot of the time and really not attuned to. So maybe they're coming from a family of origin where they feel really uncomfortable a lot of the time. Maybe it's very, ill-fitting and very painful much of the time. Well, something like that could certainly cause just a kind of like mindful rejection of authority elsewhere in their lives. Another thing could be that maybe the specific authority or the specific authorities that are relating to the kid have issues when it comes to their legitimacy. Maybe they're treating the kid in a way that's very controlling, that doesn't respect their autonomy, that's very dehumanizing. If a kid is being disrespected on a regular basis, why should we expect them to be respectful in return? A big thing that I've talked about on this channel is just how problematic schooling is in our society. People really, generally speaking, don't learn or develop well when their education is being rigidly controlled by this authority that has tremendous power over them. And so I think it's very understandable that many kids are going to reject that and they are going to kind of rebel against that because they're in touch with their own needs and they're in touch with their own sense of healthiness. It's just that in our society, we've come to accept to such a great degree this rather, I would say, insane educational arrangement. And so it looks like the kids that resist this are the abnormal ones. And so the kid's real perspective is typically denied and ignored, or often treated as crazy. And it's a strange thing because so often there are various professionals that are involved in these situations that are given kind of go-to resource for understanding these kids and for managing them. People like mental health professionals, school psychologists, educational consultants, things like that. And you'd think that they would really care about the kid's real perspective, as opposed to just encouraging us to continue to view them as crazy for thinking and feeling what they do. But I think what really happens is these professionals are being hired to control the kid and to kind of validate our existing paradigms that we utilize about them. And they will often sort of pretend to listen to the kid and offer a kind of fake warmth or something like that. But really what they're doing is basically kind of shaping the kids so that they fit better in their environment. And what that looks like, I would say, largely would depend on what kind of professional they are and what they do. So with psychiatrists, they will often drug and label the kid with the hopes that the drug will help control their behavior or suppress their feelings. With mental health professionals, they will often sort of engage in a kind of mind control, you could say, where it's sort of like indoctrinating them into fitting into the culture that surrounds them. Sometimes behavior technicians are hired, and they will basically program them as though they're Pavlov's dogs. And so they're being hired to control these kids, but we believe that it's support. And I think often that can be very well-meaning, but often, again, that's not what the kid is experiencing. They're not experiencing real support. They're experiencing control, and it can really be sort of torture to go through these things. And so what is this approach for understanding and managing kids that have issues with authority do? Well, for one, it doesn't meaningfully address the problem. It can cause a lot of trauma for the kid. It can cause a lot of emotional wounds and self-limiting beliefs that can stay with them for a very long time, well into adulthood. It takes often a lot of money from the parents. Often parents are sort of fear-mongered into spending a fortune, often into spending money they don't have. Sometimes parents can take out loans in order to pay for these interventions for their kids. And so there can be quite a predatory aspect to it. And it can severely damage the relationship between the kid and their parents. So I think overall, this way of understanding and managing these kids that have issues with authority is highly problematic. And it would really pay to actually care about the perspective of the kid and look more meaningfully into the actual nature of the situation, which often has much more to do with the environment rather than the kid. And again, this very concept of a kid that has issues with authority is very telling because it's 100% from the perspective of the adults. In particular, it's 100% from the perspective of adults that are trying to manage and control them, even if they're very well-meaning about it. It's not from the perspective of the kid. I mean, what self-respecting person is going to accept an identity as somebody that has issues with authority? And this is what kids experience all the time. They experience these people with so much power over them projecting these kinds of things onto them, and it's very uncomfortable, and they just have to accept it. And it betrays the fact that we as adults tend not to care that much about the real perspective of these kids. And so if we don't care about the real perspective, why should we expect them to treat us with respect and deference in return? So these are some of my general thoughts on understanding kids that have issues with authority. I hope that this video has been interesting and helpful for you. Please consider sharing it with anybody who you think might enjoy it. Please also subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end, and I look forward to having you for the next one.